Hello. Right. Is everybody's fine? Are you okay? Hello, everyone. Right. Happy to have you again. To keep on this long study about Europe mixed with some British issues too, right? So, it's gone. It's gone. It's springtime refreshing, right? There was a need for rejuvenation. Hello, everyone. I'm afraid the beard will be back once we're back from lockdown, right? If we still have to go with lockdown, I have plenty of time to have the beard being back. So that was the moment. Anyway, I hope everybody's doing well. Two things before we move on this subject. So you must have had the planning for this week, right? Just a reminder. The planning is that today we'll be working on the European project up to the Maastricht Treaty. On Wednesday, we'll be back to the study of the United Kingdom, and we'll see why the years between 1964 and 1979 were years when the consensus was still working, but the UK was declining. And on Friday, I think we'll be starting Thatcher, possibly. I see if I have some time to start Thatcher, right? Okay, right. Two things before we move on. So firstly, as you know, I'm still waiting for instructions regarding what Cambridge is expecting from us for your baccalaureate marks. Cambridge has made it very clear to the OIB in France that they want to maintain some form of control over your marks. So apparently we're not planning to have any type of baccalaureate exams, of course, because circumstances won't enable them to be held. But clearly, Cambridge won't be satisfied with just having me telling them, okay, this guy should get a 17 and this girl should get a 16. They will certainly ask from us to organize something which will be certainly more formal than this. So this is the reason why, as I've told you, I intend to maintain the mock orals. I'm preparing a schedule right now, and you will have it before the end of the week. And I'm planning it for certainly the week after the holidays, okay? The week after the holidays, normally we're not back to school. We still have one way to go because going back to school is on the 4th of May, possibly. That leaves us with the first week to try and hold some orals. So I will see if I can arrange with my colleagues so they can let you free for a longer time. And maybe we can have like 2 days, in a row where everybody will be evaluated according to some oral. I don't know if it will be a full key issue and a full key term. I don't know yet. I will let you know, but I swear you will know as soon as possible. But it will be based on the key issues and keywords you had to prepare. There won't be new key terms, okay? Or new key issues. I'm not adding anything to this. And then, in case we're back to school at some point, possibly in May, possibly in late May, possibly in early June, I will see how to adapt the marking scheme, right? And once again, I swear it's the case, the aim is only for you to get extra marks. There's no way, I wouldn't be sure we won't get back to school. I'm not sure that the government wants you to stay home. And just symbolically, I think, no, it's not impossible. It's not impossible. Honestly, it's not. I'm not saying we will go back to school according, to the traditional way. They could send the terminal back to school, for example, just because they've got some evaluations to be made for the back. We don't have to send everybody to school. I don't know. Anyway. Feel reassured that all the evaluations you would have would only be upward evaluation from me. That's all I can tell you. I don't think you risk much from Monsieur Eropoulos' marking so far up to the end of the year. And from me, if I were to give you some more marks, they would only be positive marking. Okay, that's it. Now, I want to keep on working because you need to maintain. Some of you that will go to social studies and prep classes, and everybody that will actually be a citizen needs to know more about Europe. If you remember, don't worry. Yeah, there's a risk of having too many tests. Oh, my connection is going away. Can you still have me? Okay, my connection is back apparently. So today, as you can read in the title, we're going to work about Europe from 1957, the creation of the EEC, to the Maastricht Treaty. Okay? Oh no, there won't be multiple choice questions with me. I will never do that. I hate them. Anyway, if you're okay with that, I'm going to tell you why there was a move from a European community to a European Union. Okay? And this covers half a century, a bit less than half a century. It covers the period between 1957 and 1992, from the Treaty of Rome to the Treaty of Maastricht. And as usual, I'm going to split. So that corresponds, I'm sorry, but I may need to connect it to what you have on Moodle. On Moodle, that corresponds to the lesson on the European project, part 2. What we're studying today is the European project since the Hague Congress, part 2, and that covers the period between the Treaty of Rome, 1957, and the Maastricht Treaty, 1992. During this period, the European project had to deal with 3 questions. How united should Europeans be? Or to say differently, how deep should the European construction be? How strong should the cooperation between states be? Should it be purely economic? Should it go beyond the economy? Should it be more political? Should we create more common institutions and so on? How united is the first question, and that's going to be my first part. Second question, how wide should it be? Remember, the Treaty of Rome was signed by 6 countries: West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. Very soon, the UK would apply. But if the UK applied, Ireland could come, Denmark could come. And so, where should Europe stop? Let me give you a spoiler. No one knows. No one has yet decided where the European Union could stop, because we're not sure exactly where Europe stops. So it means that they have to define new criteria. How united should it be? How large? How wide should it be? Who can be in Europe is another question. And while they were discussing this in the 1980s, there was a huge challenge for the Europeans. Europe had started during the Cold War. And the Cold War came to an end in 1989 with the opening of the Berlin Wall and the end of the East-West confrontation. And that totally unsettled the European project. Why? Because the European project started with countries which were very similar. When I say very similar, I'm not talking necessarily in terms of only culture, but the economy of France, Germany, Belgium, Italy was very similar. The standards of living were very similar. The relationship to a market economy, the fact that they all accepted the market economy and capitalism, that made these countries very similar. Also, they were neighbors physically. I mean, their borders were common and so on. Suddenly, the question was, should the former communist countries be part of Europe? And you know the answer is yes, but it took time to decide this. So today, that's part 2 of the lesson, and there will be 3 aspects. As usual, all this will be completed little by little and then posted on Moodle. Okay? So if you're okay with that, I would like to start with how united. That's my first part for today. How united should Europe be? I'm not going to focus on all the forms of integration. I'm going to have 3 focal studies. The first one will be about something called, well, it's very exciting, it's called the Common Agricultural Policy. But even if that doesn't sound like, wow, it's not sexy, but actually it's quite interesting because it's been a huge, huge achievement by the Europeans, because it turned Europe from being importing food, mostly from the USA, to being an exporter of food. So the Common Agricultural Policy was a success. Then we'll move on to what led to a monetary union. These were the roots of the euro, but it started in the year 1970s. And finally, we'll see that more integration came with the increasing role of the European Parliament. Okay? Good. The joy of the OIB is that so that's something you're going to avoid and dodge this year. This is a possible key term for the OIB. And this was a possible key term for the OIB. Common Agricultural Policy. It must be 4 or 5 years ago, some of your, sorry, my bad. Some of your predecessors had this as a key term, Common Agricultural Policy. And of course, they were not very happy with that, but actually, it's not very difficult to understand. So, firstly, the Common Agricultural Policy was set up in 1962. And it is the first major European policy which was implemented. Very briefly, what was it about? It's the early 1960s. It was the early 1960s. And Europe still was facing the post-reconstruction period, and the economy of Europe still needed to import some agricultural goods, okay? And in the meantime, there was a social change which was coming very fast. Fewer and fewer people in Europe were farmers. That was due to industrialization. That was due to industrialization. That was due to the tertiarization, a more and more service economy. And there were fewer and fewer peasants. Problem? When you lose the farming activity, when the farming activity is declining, there is a risk of losing your independence, your self-sufficiency. You know, that's something I've already mentioned, and I think it's something you have to understand, not for your back, but more generally. If you want to be a power in the world, whether it's soft, hard, smart, whatever, you have to make sure you are as little dependent as possible. What I mean is that the more dependent you are towards foreign powers, the less powerful you are, because the weaker you are. I always quote this example. Among the things that prevent Japan from being a top power, it's an important power. I'm not saying Japan is not powerful, but it's not a major power. You know what it is? The fact that Japan still has to import 30% of its food consumption. It means that it is possible even today in 2020, to starve Japan. If a country decided to blockade Japan today, it would take only a few months before Japan would starve. That's something you won't be able to do with the US. That's something you won't be able to do with China. That's something you won't be able to do with France or the European Union. The UK, the USA, China, France are self-sufficient in food production. And this is exactly what the European community wanted to have made by the common agricultural policy. How does it work? In a few words, very easily. Europe is seen as a single agricultural market. It means that when you are in Europe, let's say this is Europe, when you're in Europe, you can exchange all the agricultural goods freely. It's a single market. But if countries from abroad want to export food to Europe, they have to pay taxes. They have to pay tariffs. You remember what tariffs are? The tax you pay at the custom when you cross the border. Okay? If you are, let me give you one example. You are a company, a French company, that produces agro-industrial goods. You produce cakes, for example, or biscuits on an industrial scale. Your Danone, for example, okay, or Lu, or whatever brand you want. You produce cookies. To produce cookies, what do you need? You need chocolate. But that's okay because that's not a product which is being produced in Europe. So you can import cocoa if you want. But you need sugar, and sugar is produced in Europe. If you decide to import sugar from the rest of the world because it's less expensive, you will pay a tax on it to compensate, and this tax will go to the European farmers. If you want to import cereals to bake your cookies, and you decide to import wheat from the USA, then you will pay a tax on importing wheat from the USA, and this tax will go to the European farmers. And so, of course, you understand that the aim was to encourage the European companies and the European citizens to buy European agricultural goods. It was a kind of protectionist policy. It was a protectionist policy for the European farmers. It still exists today to some point. It was a huge success. Why? Because it brought self-sufficiency to Europe. The European Union today is a net exporter of agricultural goods. The European Union is the first agricultural producer in the world. France currently is the second cereal exporter in the world, for example. Why was it a failure? For two reasons. So it worked very well economically, but there were two limits, two failures. It encouraged only big farming. The bigger farmers were, the more subsidies they would get from Europe. And this is why small farmers have tended to disappear, whereas the cereal growers in La Beauce, the farmers specialized in cereal growing, or those who have huge fields of whether cereals or beetroot or maize, whatever, they have gotten the best subsidies. So clearly, it's an encouragement to big farming more than small farming. And there was a lot of environmental issues. Why? Because farmers were encouraged to produce more. And to produce more, they use more and more fertilizers, more and more mechanization. And for example, they've raised a lot of trees. Okay, it's called remembrement in France. Taking small fields and gathering them together to have big fields easier to farm. But that means raising the hays, raising the trees down, and this has had an impact on the environment. So the CAP, very efficient. It made Europe self-sufficient in food, and that's brilliant. Problem, it has created some environmental problems. This is the type of achievements that Europe has made. And it's, I mean, economically speaking, and in terms of making Europe a powerful agricultural producer, it's a huge success. Okay? The reason why food is cheap in Europe, and I can tell you one thing, food is cheap in Europe, including quality products, right? What I mean is that if you compare the price of bread, if you compare the price of cereals, if you compare the price of fruit, compared to the median revenue, compared to the average revenue of people, food is cheap in Europe. Okay, this is not the major problem for Europeans. Sorry, what's written? It's a success. It proved a successful policy because it enabled self-sufficiency. It also proved a failing policy because it has created environmental issues. Also, it's very expensive because the CAP, and that's my last point, had a specific budget taxes, tariffs that were collected were not sufficient to offer support to the farmers. So the European countries, the member of the EEC, had to give more money. And who took advantage of this? France, a lot. France was a net benefiter of the agricultural policy. And when the UK entered the EEC, they say, wow, the CAP, it's costing a lot. We should reduce it. Margaret Thatcher had a very famous sentence. She said, I want my money back, like the UK won't pay for France agriculture. But that's for next time. So this is one proof that the Europeans wanted to increase their unity. Secondly, the question of monetary union. Okay. In 1971, there was a major change in the world. It was the end of the Bretton Woods system. And the Bretton Woods system was a system in which the dollar was the stabilizer of trade. What does that mean? That's something I've already explained when we studied the UK. If you wanted to make international trade, there was one currency which was hyper stable, a currency that was hyper reliable, a currency which value remained strong whatever happened, and you could trade with this money, and that was the dollar. I'm going to answer your question, Mason. I'm just finishing this. But I will answer your question, which is a very relevant question. And in 1971, that was over. And you know why it was over? Because it was the Vietnam War, and the USA was spending billions of dollars in the war, and they could not guarantee the value of their currency anymore. And Richard Nixon, the president of the United States at that time, decided to stop the convertibility between dollar and gold. So what did that create? That created the fear that currencies, that money in Germany, that currency in France, that currency in the UK, that currency in Italy could not change a lot in between them, that their convertibility, that their change rate could vary too much. I can give you one example. If you are if you're a French industrialist, okay, let's take my example, and you produce cookies. Because or thanks to the common agricultural policy, you are encouraged to buy your wheat and sugar in Europe, in the European community. For example, the Germans produce a lot of sugar from sugar beetroot, like in Labos, actually. So you decide to buy sugar from Germany because it's maybe best quality for you, let's say. But that means you're going to pay in a different currency. At that time, the French used the French franc, the German used the German Deutschmark. Before 1971, these currencies were stabilized because the dollar played the role of stabilizer. In 1971, that was over. So there was a risk that maybe variations between the franc and the Deutschmark would go to much wider gaps. But that's very bad for business, because if I buy cereals in Germany or if I buy rice in Italy, I don't want the value of the different currencies to change. And so what was it decided? It was decided to create something called the European monetary system, or also called the snake. I'm going to show you what it was called the snake. European snake, European monetary snake. I'm going to answer your question. No, it's very good if we have Terminal ES here. So I have a few questions I'm going to answer. The first one is by Maysan. Can every farmer benefit from the CAP? Yes, depending on the type of production. Actually, there have been 3 periods in the CAP. Period number 1, the more you produced, the more you would get. And this was until the 90s, until the 1990s. This benefited to the largest farmers. The bigger, the more you get. That's stage one. Second stage, it was decided to encourage farmers that would maintain some specific productions, even if they were small farmers. Example, sheep breeding. In France, you have few sheep breeders, but as it's rare in France, these people were given some money. And today, it is related to your environmental performance. The more organic food you grow, the better. The quality too. If you produce quality cereals, quality wines, quality fruit, like for example, if you are in an appellation d'origine contrôlée or something like this, or protégée, you may get specific revenue from the CAP. So now it's not only about how big a farmer you are, it's also what do you produce. Is it environmentally friendly, like organic food or pesticide-less food? Do you maintain some specific landscape? For example, if you are a sheep breeder in l'Aveyron, which is a wonderful place, and it's magnificent in terms of landscape, but it's poor. And you've got the shepherds in these places, they help maintain the landscape, so they get subsidies from the European Union to do this type of job. Okay, so I have tried to answer your question. Secondly, Jade, very good remark. This was created to make sure that the French currency, the German currency, the Italian currency, the Belgian currency would remain on a fixed rate. Let me explain you something. And the terminal ES, you know this already, but not everybody may know it. Right. Right, this is a graph. Okay. Let's imagine that this is, I'm totally inventing it, right? This is the variation of the French franc, the value of the franc, compared to the German currency. Okay, so let's imagine that's the German currency here. And this is how the French franc has changed. In this case, the French franc is of less value than the German mark. Here it is in of higher value, then less value, then higher value. But if this variation happen during 1 year, what does that mean? I'm exaggerating a bit actually, but it means that if you are a French merchant and you've sold something to a German person in January, but the person pays in April, and that happens a lot when you do trade, being paid 2, 3, or 4 months later, you've sold it at this price. So the German entrepreneur is like, wow, I've made good business. I've bought French goods at low price. Oh, but 3 months later, the prices have risen a lot. This is exactly what happens when the change rates between currencies are floating, are changing all the time. And you know what? Business hates this because you can't foresee what you'll do in 3 months. What is the European monetary snake? It's a system which says, this is the German currency. The French franc compared to the German currency, the French franc compared to the Italian lire, The French franc compared to the florint, which is the money in the Netherlands at that time, cannot vary more than 1%. Okay? It means that instead of having these huge variations between currencies, you have limited variation. And the aim was to reduce the variation little by little. It started at 3%, then 2%, then 1%. I'm sure you can guess what the aim was in the end. The aim was to stop completely the variation of currencies so that you could create a single currency. This system of monetary union, rapprochement of the European snake was created in 1972. 1 year after the end of Bretton Woods, the Europeans say, okay, we need to stabilize our currencies together. At the time, the aim was not to create a single currency. The euro was not planned yet. The plan, the project was to say, let's make sure that on a long term, there won't be too much variation between the Deutschmark, the Italian currency, the German currency, the French currency, the Luxembourgish currency. Okay? Right? Okay. Stock exchange is a bit different, because stock exchange, you know what? Stock exchange can actually benefit from huge variation in currencies. So it's not exactly the principle for stock exchange. On the contrary, the value of a stock can vary a lot. Okay? Take care. You've got two things. You've got stock exchange to exchange shares of a company, but in the stock exchange, you may also buy monetary shares, and generally they're called state bond, but you can also buy and sell some currency. But generally, this is between central banks. It's not that it's not an interesting point, but I would not like to start some monetary theory right now. Firstly, because I'm not a specialist, and secondly, because that would take us away from the core of my subject today. It was not, Alicia, to answer your question, it was not exactly decided as a Bretton Woods initiative, because Bretton Woods was dead. Bretton Woods was dead in 1972. It was more the consequence of, noticing and reconning that Bretton Woods agreements were dead, and that now the Europeans should find a way to stabilize their money, their currencies, to stabilize the value of their currencies without the USA intervening in this. So clearly, that made the Europeans more autonomous with their currencies. And that, of course, I'm just going to conclude on this, paved the way for a single currency. And the original name was not the euro. I've seen other questions. I'm going to answer them. It was the ECU, ECU, European Current Unit, Unité Monétaire Européenne, ECU. The name was invented at first by French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, because he said that will remind the French of l'écu, which was a medieval currency, and so on. And the name was finally changed to euro, because l'écu was also was a currency which was used in the Middle Ages when France was dominating the European trade. And so l'écu sounded too French, whereas euro is more neutral. So Maysan, that's a very good question. States that did not take part in the euro. So let's just write this to make sure. Right, the ECU was the pre-euro. It was the plan for a future euro. The countries that decided not to join the euro, they still were here. Even if you didn't join the euro, you would stay in this European, containment of variation. You still would stay here. Like, for example, the British pound would be tight to euro, okay, with the European snake. So even if you did not accept the euro, you would have to maintain the value of your currency, like the Danish crown or the British pound. They had to respect the European system anyway, even if they were not in the euro. Okay? Good. So that's called the European Monetary Union. I've seen UME, Union Monétaire Européenne. That's called the Monetary Union. This was started in the 1970s and 1980s, and this has led to the Maastricht Treaty and the creation of the euro. Finally, that's a good question, and there's no proper answer to this question. Have the countries that have kept their currency benefited from keeping their currency? There are advantages, there are drawbacks. I'm not sure it's going to be a very useful answer. What's the advantage? The advantage is that clearly you can play on the value of your currency in times of crisis. You can devaluate a bit for your economy to be more competitive. You can give more value if you need to import more. So you can play on the value of your currency to be more competitive. But in the meantime, you're losing the major advantage of having a common currency, which is that people trade more between themselves, between countries, when they have a common currency. Today, if I decide to buy a good on a website located in Germany, located in Spain, located in any country from the Eurozone, I don't have to wonder how much it costs. I can immediately compare and say, okay, that's 16 euro. I know what 16 euro is, and I know that my bank won't take me money because I had to convert from euro to another currency. Okay, I'll just give one example, but I'm sure everybody does that. As a musician, there is a famous website. It's called Thomann. It sells a lot of musical devices online, and it's all in euros. So it's very easy for me to say, okay, can I compare this with my local music store? That's it. When I buy on an American website or a British website, depending on the moment of the year, maybe the prices will vary. Plus, my bank may sometimes say, okay, you're paying in dollars, so we're going to charge you for the conversion and so on. Okay? And that's true. Keeping your currency leaves you with the capacity to leave the European Union more easily. Tomorrow, if France decided to leave the European Union and to go François Asselineau, l'UPR, Frexit, and so on, wow. We would need to change our currency. I'm sure that going back to the franc would mean like the value of the franc would lose like 30, 40, 50% in a few hours. That would be an economic and financial disaster for France. Why? Because one reason why France can borrow money easily is because this money will be paid back in euro. And that France is not only responsible for its own debt, Europe is actually responsible for France's debt. So that makes the capacity for France or Italy or Spain to pay back their debt stronger. So having a common currency makes you stronger also in this. Okay? Wow, Frorti, yeah. I think Frexit sounds better, right? Frorti. Wow, what a dreadful word. Okay, finally, and I'm going to conclude. Oh, I was a bit long. So one other element of integration is that in 1979, the European Parliament was elected following the universal suffrage. And that means that Europe also maintained its political project, because that's highly economic. That's highly economic. That's more political. Since 1979, European citizens can vote for their European Member of Parliament. What does that mean? It means a political integration. It also means that Europe was willing to become a more democratic institution. It sent a signal that the European countries were willing to be more democratic in the European institution, and that they were willing to deepen the political construction of Europe. Okay? Right. So it proved that the years 70s, 60s, that's for the CAP, 70s, that's for the European Union, and of the 70s and 80s were years of a more united Europe, more links between the country of the European community. But in the meantime, if you're okay with that, I just would like to take 10 minutes more. Can we do that? Actually, if you want to leave, you can leave, right? But if we can use 10 minutes more, I can conclude on this. I won't teach the last one, but I can conclude on this. Another question was how large Europe should be, how wide it should be. And there were actually 3 questions. Firstly, the British problem. That's something we've already discussed. The USA, so I'm going to answer your question immediately. The US reaction to both was very positive. The EEC was actually highly supported by the USA, because for them the European community was a free market zone. It was promoting economic liberalism. It was promoting a free economy, which was opposing the communist model. So for the USA, creating the EEC was perfect because it would encourage free trade. It would help Europe recover faster, so the USA wouldn't have to give money to Europe to rebuild. And also, the USA would have another strong economic zone to trade with. So the EEC was highly supported by the USA. Later, I will discuss the reaction of the USA to the Maastricht Treaty, but they also supported it because it was the post-Cold War, and the USA at that time, it was under Bill Clinton and its enlargement policies. They said, every country that supports democracy, every country that supports a global capitalist economy will have the support of the USA. And this is exactly what the European Union was trying to do. So the USA supported the creation of the EEC. the European Union, the USA supported the creation of the European Union. The first president to openly criticize and oppose the European Union in the USA is Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump wants all partners of the USA to be weak. He wants to negotiate with weak partners to impose the US will. So for him, the European Union is too strong an organization. And this is why he congratulated Boris Johnson for making Brexit a reality. Because he knew that without the UK, Europe would be weaker. And he knew that without Europe, the UK would be weaker. And that's exactly what he wants. He wants weaker, I was about to say partners. He doesn't want partners. He wants weaker confrontation. Confrontation, not the word I'm looking for, but the people he's discussing with, the people he negotiates with, the people he deals with should be weaker. But he's the first president in the USA to say it publicly. Okay? So, British problem. 2 vetoes by de Gaulle. I've already mentioned them. And the reason why de Gaulle rejected the British application, I will develop in the lesson on the UK, right, on next Wednesday. Eventually, the UK joined in 1973, and that means 3 new countries entered: UK, Ireland, Denmark. In 1973, the UK joined alongside Ireland and Denmark. The EEC was now 9. Then 3 more countries would join in the 1980s: Greece, Spain, and Portugal. Why? Because these countries were authoritarian countries in the 1970s. There was Franco in Spain, there was Salazar in Portugal, there was the colonial dictatorship in Greece. In these 3 countries, the dictatorship collapsed, so they were able to integrate Europe. And the common point is that the 3 of them were former dictatorships. So in 1981, Greece became a member of the EEC, then Spain and Portugal. If you prefer, it was a way to lock them into democracy. Because Europe said, you want to be in Europe, you want to be in the EEC, you have to be a democratic regime. So Greece, which was a poor country, Spain and Portugal, which were poor countries, they kind of committed into democracy to have the financial support and the security of being in the EEC. It was a kind of deal. We stop being dictatorship and we can integrate the EEC. Finally, and that's my final point for today, in 1975, I don't know if you remember this, it was the climax of the détente. And an agreement was signed in Helsinki, which is Finland's capital. And these Helsinki agreements say that travel, the circulation of ideas, the situation of intellectuals, the circulation of tourists should now be free in Europe. And this created new link between the EEC and Eastern Europe. If some of you study German, you may have heard of something called the Ostpolitik. The Ostpolitik was a policy followed by West Germany, by the West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, and it was dialoguing, speaking with East Germany again. So it's the policy of the East, and it was a way to reconcile. It was a way to reconcile the West and the East Germans. Also, trade between the West and East of Europe developed. Okay, at that time in France, there was a man, I can't remember his precise name. He was nicknamed Le Milliardaire Rouge because he was a member of the Communist Party, but he also was a businessman, and he made a lot of business with Czechoslovakia and the USSR and Poland and so on. And he became very rich by making business with the Soviet Union, but he was a member of the Communist Party. So that sounds very strange to become a millionaire when you're in the Communist Party. But anyway, so it proved that in the 1970s, the question was, should the European project open to Eastern Europe too? Okay, right. So that means that the two questions we have discussed today. Sorry, I can't find mine. Okay. So first question was how united Europe was. It was more and more united with more and more common projects, a common agricultural policy, a common monetary union, and a common parliament elected on the universal suffrage. It also was a wider Europe with the integration of the UK after 2 vetoes by de Gaulle, which I will discuss in the next lesson, opening to new countries of Southern Europe that used to be dictatorships, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and trying and develop new links with Eastern Communist Europe. Okay? And that would be concluded by the major change, and the major change was the Maastricht Treaty. But that's for later when we study Europe after the Maastricht Treaty. So this was supposed to be for a further lesson. Okay? So for today, we've seen that the years between 1957 and 1992 were years of hesitation. Should Europe be deeper, more deeply united, more deeply integrated? Or should Europe be larger? Should it have more countries? And the Europe community was not able to choose. They did a bit of both. They increased their relations, they increased the number of countries involved. Okay? They increased their political integration, economic integration, and they went from 6 to 12. 6 countries in 1957, 12 countries in 1986. The next step would be to clearly define what Europe could be. And that would be the role of the Maastricht Treaty signed in 1992. But I think that will belong to after the holidays if we follow our program. I think it's oxymoronic, yes, to be a communist. It's not necessarily an oxymoron to be a communist and a businessman, but to be a communist and a millionaire. That sounds pretty unconvincing as an association, I guess. I'm not sure Lenin would have validated the compatibility of being a communist millionaire, right? Okay. Right. Do you have any question? So I'm going to scan this as usual. And as I've told you, that corresponds to part 2. Pencil stains. That corresponds to part 2 of the lesson you have on the European project. The end of the week, on Wednesday and Friday, we'll be talking about the pre-Thatcher years, and on Friday, how Thatcher started a revolution in the UK, a conservative revolution, a neoliberal revolution, and how she dismantled the consensus on the welfare state to create a new consensus, which is called the neoliberal consensus. Okay? Right. Any question? We're done. Well, okay. Actually, I was able to do that in 1 hour. Not too bad. Do you have some questions or remarks or anything I can help with? Why should or why could or why would the European Union accept more countries? I can give you 4 answers. Okay, and I'm not sure each is not isolated, they can go together. Firstly, it's called the European Union. And so by definition, it was created to accept all European countries. So I think one reason why the European Union accept new countries, it's because the aim is to have all European or as many European countries in the Union as possible. Secondly, because today in the world, who's powerful? The USA, 330 million inhabitants. China, 1.4 billion inhabitants. There is a demographic power. It exists. If you want to influence the world, the demography may be something. And so the European Union started with 150 million people, and today it has 550 million people. So accepting new countries is also increasing the demographic power. The more countries you have, third reason, the more countries you have, the more complementarity you have between the countries, because it will increase the available amount of resources. It will increase the variety, the diversity of resources you may have. When you integrate Scandinavian countries, there are new resources coming in Europe: fish, wood, touristic places. When you integrate the Eastern European countries, for example, when Poland was integrated, Poland can export a lot of coal and iron. So it does this. Also more labor force. And that's the fourth reason. By integrating poorer countries like Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Croatia, the European Community and Union has integrated countries with low cost of labor. And so instead of moving industries to China or moving industries to Eastern Asia or moving industry to North Africa, European companies were able to move their business within Europe, because within Europe, they would be able to find labor forces that would be less expensive. And so for all these reasons, also one last element, when you're a member of the European Union, so I've told you 4, there are 5 actually. When you're a member of the European Union, you have to be a democracy. And accepting new countries, and I'm thinking of the Balkan countries like Albania or possibly Moldova or possibly Kosovo later, is also a way to lock these countries in democracy in the very same way that it was done with Spain, Greece, Portugal in the 1980s. So if you want to put that differently, there are both political, diplomatic, cultural, and economic reason to have more countries in the European Union. So the more numerous, the merrier, or the more numerous, the happier, but also the more numerous, the stronger. Okay? I'll just give you one element. When China wants to invest in Europe, it's totally different investing in an EU member or not in an EU member. When a Chinese company invests in an EU member, the rules are much stronger. The social rules, the environmental rules, the tax rules are stronger in the European Union than out of the European Union. So having a larger union is also a way, to make sure that the European Union policies are more influential worldwide. That's it. Okay? Right. Any other question? I hope I've answered your question, and I hope I was clear in my answer. Any other question you may have? If you don't have more, yes, of course, it's a matter of domination and dominance. You can say both, actually. Of course, it's also a matter of power. The European Union is not a philanthropic organization. It's a zone, it's an area which wants to preserve the power, influence, and soft power of Europe. So the strategy of having more countries is part of this. Okay? Right. If you have no more questions, then it's time to put an end to this session. Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks a lot for being behind your screen. And see you same place on Wednesday. Let's say 2:15. Okay, 2:15. And we'll work on, if you can have your notes on Britain, I will complete, I can't find it, but I will complete this with you. I don't know if you remember, that was a mind map or more a chart we started on the UK about a consensus. So I will complete this on Wednesday before we move on to Margaret Thatcher. Okay? Thank you. Take care of yourself, and see you very soon. Bye-bye.